All right. Hi, welcome everybody. It's great to see you. We're here for another BiotensegriTea party. I'm Susan Lowell Desolorcino coming to you from Washington, D.C. I'm here with my co-host, Chris Marita Clancy.
Hi, everyone. I'm happy to be here with all of you. I'm coming from just outside of Vancouver on Coast Salish territory.
And Graham Scar.
Hello, I'm in sunny Nottingham in the UK.
And we've got Steve Levin with us as well.
Hi, all.
And today we have a very special guest, Dr. Sérgio Fonseca, coming to us not from Brazil, but from, are you in Amsterdam?
Rotterdam.
In Rotterdam.
Yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. And we'll get Sergio's background and all of that stuff in a few minutes after he does his presentation. And we're really very excited about getting into some of this ecological psychology stuff more. So thank you, Sérgio, for being here.
Welcome.
And he's agreed to do our toast today.
Okay, so I raise this glass as a toast, and I'm quite thankful for the invitation to be here with you today and have the opportunity to share a little bit with of my work with all of you. Thank you very much, and cheers.
Yes.
Cheers. Wonderful. And of course, I think most of you know this is an all-volunteer production from the Stephen M. Levin Biotensegrity Archive. We are grateful for your donations when you send them in. We try to use them very responsibly to support education and research and community development around the world. So I think we should start with your presentation. Sérgio, unless you want to go over your background first.
It's up to you. I'll follow what's the tradition. Like I can introduce myself, or you can do this later, or even if you want to do it now, feel free to do so. So it doesn't matter.
Well, yeah, why don't we go ahead right to the presentation?
Okay.
So I think that will give us the best foundation.
Very good.
That we won't repeat anything.
Okay.
So I'm going to ask everyone to turn your cameras and microphones off, as I will also do. And we'll let Sérgio screen share and do his presentation.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen just to make sure that everything's running perfectly. Okay, how is it now?
That looks great.
Okay, good. So the idea, following this ecological perspective that the BiotensegriTea Party is doing the last few weeks or few months, I want to talk a little bit more about the relationship between biotensegrity and ecological psychology. Specifically, I'm going to talk about haptic perception. But before we go to haptic perception, I want to locate ecological psychology within different perspectives on human movement. So I will start with that. Okay, so let me just close one thing that's in front of my screen. Okay, the first thing that I would like to talk with you today is different perspectives on human movement. Although everyone talks about movement, not everyone sees the movement in the same way. Okay, there are different perspectives, different theoretical backgrounds. So it's important for us to understand where I'm coming from. Okay, so historically, the first perspective on human movement was basically what is known as address-specific control. That's the idea that there exists some kind of controller, some kind of entity that is responsible for everything that we do in terms of motion. So that's the ghosting machine. In this picture that you see is represented by the ghost that has access to different scores, musical scores, let's say as a metaphor, that allows it to choose the kind of movement. And this movement is played in this cortical keyboard that goes through the spinal keyboard and access specific structures that must be controlled. Those could be motor units, the alpha gamma unit, muscles, or joints. And that's why it's address specific control. That's the idea that the controller has access and is capable of controlling specific structures. This idea, that's a kind of a 1900s idea, was replaced afterwards by a different idea, like a different perspective. That is the computational one, and more modern views of this computational approach would be the the computational control view of human movement. And the analogy that we have here is this marionette, the puppet, and the brain as the computer or the controller is responsible for engaging the spine and some synergies that will control muscles or produce the movements. The difference here is that the brain doesn't do everything. There are respect for the existence of the Newton mechanics related to the body parts. So the brain actually collaborates with the parts in order to produce movement. So it's kind of a more modern view. But both of them belong to the same global perspective on human movement. That's information processing. The first one is strictly neural. So everything that is taking into consideration is the neural aspect of control. But the second one recognizes the influence of non-neural factors. For example, the body itself, the synergies, the mechanics, the forces related to the environment. So it expands this initial idea about the movement. The first one is based on representation, selection, and translation. So the movement is represented as the idea, the classical idea of a motor program or engrams that's selected, translated into impulses, and the movement happens. The second one is based on an idea of planning execution akin to what we call in biomechanics as direct dynamics or reverse dynamics. So it's kind of a computational approach in which the brain computes the angles based on the forces the system can produce. So it's a more biomechanical motor control type of approach in terms of movement. In the first one, the executor, the ghost, is omniscient about everything that's happening there. So it knows everything about the environment and about the body. And the second one assumes some executive ignorance. So the controller doesn't need to know everything about the movement. So some level of ignorance is accepted there. And both of them are based on models, so they are model dependent. So the movement must be represented inside the system. So not only the environment, but the body is represented internally and used accordingly in terms of controlling, in terms of the address specific control, or to compute the necessary forces to produce movement. So this is the classical information processing approach to human movement that was that is still the dominant view about movement. However, different approaches are also offered. So some contemporary views like self-organizing systems, in this case, is recognizing that the system related to movements, not only the body, but the relationship between different dynamics like the neural and body dynamics, the neuroenvironmental dynamics, and the body and environmental dynamics. And another view, that's the one that I'm going to talk today, are related to context-dependent systems. And basically what we see here in this panel is that the upper panel represents a sequence of movement that I cannot understand what's going on without representing the environment together with the view. So when I look at the lower panel, I can realize that the sequence of movements that I see there, they are actually functional. It's basically the sequence of movements of someone exchanging a tire that probably had a problem, so a sequence of movements that represent an action. So it means that I cannot understand movement without actually understanding where the movement is actually happening. So the context is fundamental for the understanding of movement. The first view is the dynamic systems view, and the second one is the ecological approach. The first one believes that the movement is a result of the interaction among systems that interact and influence each other. So those interactions that I described before. And for the second one, movement are related to processes that are distributed around the individual environment system. So the only way that I can understand the movement is to take into consideration the environment in which the movement happens. So the engaging of the individual with the environment is also fundamental for the understanding of the movement. And I'm going to talk about this, showing that this relationship between the individual and the environment is dependent on what we call perception, and basically direct perception. So in dynamic systems, movements are emerging properties. And for the ecological approach, movements are functional entities. Both are context dependent, both are model independent, so they don't require the pre-existence of models in order to produce movements. They are noise resistant because they don't rely on computational approaches in order to control movement, and they are nonlinear. So it's a very big change in terms of the classical approaches. So since we're talking about this relationship between the individual and environment, we had to introduce a little bit about perception. So the ecological approach focusing on investigating how individuals perceive and act in the environment. The first views that we saw there, they treat the environment and the agent as separate things. So, for example, perception is seen as an input and the action as an output of the two different systems that interact. So the environment represented by the object here and the agent. But this view is actually contested by ecological and dynamic approaches because perception and action are coupled. So there's no gain in separating them. So we act to perceive and we perceive to act. So among different perceptual systems, and the ecological approach started studying mostly in terms of visual perception. But in this case that we're going to talk today, I'm going to focus on the haptic perception. So among those systems, the haptic perceptual system is essential for movement, as the movement is also essential for perception. So I'm going to talk a little bit more and define what how I understand this haptic perception system. So the function of the haptic system is the perception of the body, perception of objects linked to the body, and perception of the environment adjacent to the body, all done by means of the body itself. So the body allows the perception of the body, objects, and the environment. And the basis of this system is the sensitivity to mechanical forces. So I can actually separate different aspects of haptic perception. One of them is proprioception. That's the most known one. In this figure that we see here, proprioception would be represented as the perception of the parts. In this case, the individual that's holding this rod can perceive the position of the hand. If the hand extended, if the hand is flexed, so the hand's position is perceived, and we call this as proprioception. But also, we can perceive the relationship between, we can also perceive the environment itself, right? Not only the part, but also we can perceive the environment. And for this, we call stereoception. So the perception of, for example, the object length, the object weight, the object hardness, for example, so I can perceive the environment by touching this environment. But what's interesting that I can perceive more that is related to the relationship between the object and the environment. For example, I can perceive the environment in relation to parts, and I call this exproprioception. For example, is this object that I'm holding in my hands is inclined to one side, to another side, and it's very typical, for example, for someone playing tennis that needs to know the position of the racket in relation to his or her body. And also we have the relationship between the parts and the environment. So pro-exteroception, for example, where my hand is located in relation to the object. And in tennis, the same thing. Where's my hand in relation to the handle of the racket? If I'm holding too high, too low, how it's happening. So if we think about this example that I'm giving, for example, playing tennis, we can appreciate the importance of haptic perception in all senses to allow this sport to be played. So I need to know things about the external environment, but also my relationship to that environment and in relationship to the objects that I'm linked to. So haptic perception is much broader than actually assumed. So normally we talk always about proprioception, but we actually have much more than that. Haptic perception allows us to know the environment in a much more deep way. So what would be the life without haptic perception? To show that, to give you a feeling of what is to live without haptic perception, I can report the case of Ian Waterman. Ian Waterman, he had a virus infection that caused that all his receptors below his neck were destroyed. So basically, he didn't have any sensation in his body. So below the neck, he couldn't feel anything. So basically, he was a head without a body. In this case, movement was basically impossible without vision. He could not perceive his arms, his legs, nothing, and he couldn't move any part of his body without actually have information given by the visual system. So in this case, complete attention would be necessary for any kind of voluntary control. The case of Ian Waterman is really special because there are only a few cases in the world in which that problem happened, but he was one of the few that really mastered the situation he was in, and he was capable of actually learning how to walk. But walking was basically done under visual guidance all the time. So showing that without any kind of information, he could not do that. And in our case, we use haptic perception to do this. And we don't appreciate haptic perception because there's no way for us to take it out and having understanding what would be the life without haptic perception. So how do we study haptic perception? How the study of haptic perception is basically done? Normally, to understand how we feel parts of our body, we basically separate our bodies in parts, and we look inside the parts for the receptors that send signals to the spinal cord, and we assume that those signals from the spinal cord reach our somatosensory cortex, and there the whole is put back together. So the idea is that what we separate anatomically can only be put together neurally. So what's anatomically separated is neurally integrated. So that's a big difference from what we believe that tensegrity offers. So, but we can actually contest a little bit of these known views. For example, is in fact the brain responsible for computing joint positions from the activity of the many body mechanical receptors? So just for you to understand what's going on here in these two pictures, it's two experiments in which the individual was, in the first case, he could not see his arm that was under a table, and the task was to move his arm in order to point to an object that he could see above the table. So he was moving the arm under the table in the direction of the object he could see. Notice that the properties of the arm was manipulated by having the individual holding this handle in which masses were added to different positions. The arrow that you can see there is basically an arrow that defines the mass distribution of the arm. So because we added a mass to the right, the arm would be perceived by this person as being related to the arrow. So in this case, in order to point to the object, he would point according to the mass distribution, not according to the angle. So this individual is not perceiving the angle of anything, is actually perceiving the properties of the arm. Similarly, what you see in the right part is the individual that was asked to match the position of the two elbows. And also, in this case, the mass distribution was manipulated by adding weights on top and on the bottom of the objects that he was holding. And in this case, the arrows would be representing the mass distribution. And in this case, the individuals were matching the arrows, the vectors that represent the mass distribution, not the angles of the elbow. So the individual was not perceiving angles, but perceiving properties of the body. So haptic perception is global, not based on local perception of angles that would be provided by receptors located in joints and muscles locally. And also, another interesting thing is that we can perceive properties of objects even though we don't have any kind of mechanoreceptors receptors linked to those objects. Remember when I talked about playing tennis, I can perceive properties of the racket, positions, weight, everything about those rackets, about the racket, even though I don't have any innervation and receptor linked to that structure. So haptic perception is quite interesting. So actually, we need to know the basis of haptic perception, and that was done by people in the CESPA, the Center for the Ecological Studies of Perception Action, that tried to understand what would be the invariants that could inform us about the properties of the objects and parts of our bodies that could be used for the perception, for haptic perception. In this case, they start by representing any part of the body and the objects that we could get in touch by its main moments. So it could be the 0th moment, that would be mass, the first moment, that's torque, and the second moment, that's the moment of inertia. And the moment of inertia of the limbs, the objects, about the x in which it's moved, relate to the resistance against rotation. These properties can be represented by two global variables that would be the eigenvectors that could inform about the direction of the limbs, the objects, and the eigenvalues that could inform about the magnitudes of limbs and objects. So these properties could be calculated mathematically, and it was tested to show that what we perceive when we move objects are in fact those properties. But one thing is missing here, okay? So the invariance of perception, of invariance of haptic perception that I can find in my in the physical properties of objects and in my limbs has to be conveyed through the body. So I need to explain how those properties could affect the perceiver. So since forces are required to produce movement, these forces are specific to those properties, the properties of the objects that we calculate mathematically. And since they are specific, since forces are specific to properties, they can convey information about the directions and magnitudes of the motions that the individual performs. So eigenvalues and eigenvectors provide information about the position of body segments and about the objects that are manipulated. So forces generated or applied by the body parts and attached objects, they cause tissue deformation. So since I have to use forces or the forces are affecting me, they are deforming tissues. So the patterns of these deformations, they are captured by the network of receptors located in the body's connective tissues and represent the perceived information about movement and postures. So similarly to haptic perception, so we can understand how the body must be included in the perception, we can make a parallel with auditory perception because both relies on the propagation of waves through various media. For example, sound propagates initially in air, then in liquid when it reaches our body, and finally on tissues. So those waves, they are captured by receptors that are located in our ears. But what's important there is that it's not only the receptors itself that's important, but the fact that those receptors are related to the connective tissue that can structure and unify the action of those receptors. In this case, the connective tissue, they act as springs or tuned springs that can adjust the receptive field, allowing us to perceive sounds. So without including tissue in this sound perception, we would not understand perception at all, auditory perception at all. So waves propagate in different media in the auditory system, and we need to know what's the medium that allows the flow of information about the body, its parts, and its relationships with the environment. So if you want to understand haptic perception, we need to understand its medium. To do that, we can take some lessons from the cell. Classically, a cell separated in parts would depend on an electrical process to adapt to the environment. So normally we hear all the time that the cells, in order to adapt to the environment, depends on what we call electrochemical signaling, in which an external stimulus reaches the cell and propagates within the cytoplasm in terms of chemical and electrical signals. Very similar to what we use to explain our perceptions when we talk about the whole system. However, the cell has connected elements. And because we're dealing with a cell that has tensegrity properties, we can have what's called mechanical sensation. So by being a tensegrity structure, the cell allows mechanical signaling or what is known as tension percolation. So any kind of stimulus reaching the cell propagates mechanically through at the speed of sound internally through the cell, reaching the nucleus. So mechanical sensation is crucial for the cell adaptation to the environment. So the human body, which is formed by a continuous network of connective tissue, and we know this by the facial organization and in our group, BiotensegriTea, is the medium for the force propagation that allows haptic perception. And what's interesting is that when we look for how the receptors are distributed within our body, what we see is that they organize themselves in order to extract those forces. In this picture that we see here, we have 7 muscles from the forearm of a rabbit. And each line that you see in small dots that you can see in those pictures represent the location of a Golgi organ tendon that, or muscle spindle. Okay, so the receptors, those lines or dots represent the receptors of perception, of the mechanical receptors, type 1 and 2. And when you see in the right part, The stars and the dots are the same thing, are the receptors. What's interesting here that I would like you to pay attention is that what you can see is that large portions of the muscles, they don't have any receptor. They're totally devoid of receptors. But I had to add an information here is that see those dark areas in those pictures? Those dark areas, they represent the location of the uh, intramuscular connective tissue. So with that information, we can understand that those receptors, they are located especially in those regions. So if you ask what is the principle of organization, we would say the receptors align with the fascia. The receptors align with the connective tissue. So instead of monitoring muscles, those receptors actually monitoring the flow of tension within the tensegrity structure. And also when you look, for example, more than just type 1 and 2 receptors, we see a very interesting factor. For example, when you analyze the axon to nerve endings distribution in a typical nerve, the first thing that we see is that out of the 40% of the sensory nerve endings that we see in a typical nerve, only 20% represent type 1 and 2 receptors. The majority, these interstitial receptors, they are the largest part. They represent 80% of all receptors, and they are located all over the body, especially in the connective tissue, and they are aligned according to the fascia. So basically, these mechanical receptors, they are present in this continuous network of connective tissue in a position to extract specific patterns of tension distribution and their transformation. So we can say we know, and this group is very strong in that, that the musculoskeletal system is organized like a tensegrity structure, and that's why we call it a biotensegrity. It has tissue connectivity, it has a triangular organization, and it has pre-stress. That's why we have to represent our bodies not as columns, but a tensegrity structure. And this kind of organization allows that forces applied macroscopically could be transmitted across all spatial scales. So this structure organization, acting as a medium for global force propagation, supports global perceptual process. And we call this tensegrity haptic perception hypothesis. So just to summarize a little bit this hypothesis, we can say that during geometric transformations or changes in postures and movements, each stable state is achieved through a distinct pattern of global force distribution. This pattern represents the signature of the system geometry. And the geometry here is the postural changes, the posture itself and the postural changes that we're talking about. So the mechanoreceptors embedded in the tension components, they can capture the patterns of tension distribution. These patterns are specific to the global geometry of the musculoskeletal system, and therefore can inform us about postures and movements. And we have a parallel in nature, the spider web. The spider, by being in touch with its web, can locate the presence of any insect that falls in its web, and it knows not only the specific location, but also its size and weight, just by the pattern of deformation that we see in the spider web. So like the spider web, the body has the structure that allows it to capture the global pattern of tension distribution. So basically, we can say that biotensegrity enables the medium for haptic perception. And for long, we start to think, how can we implement and test this concept? And what we did was to try to create an exoskeleton that utilized the principles of biotensegrity. So we went to the drawing board and start to think about how to create this tensegrity-based suit. And we followed the basic principles of biotensegrity organization. That would be tensional continuity, pre-stress, in triangular geodesic architecture organization. The result of this is that we could get a patent in 2012. And here we create several different prototypes. And this one I want to show you. That's the functional prototype. And just for you to have a feeling of how it works, I would like to see this. So what we see here is that there's no anchor in the body. So this floating net of connective elements are floating around the body. So the body acts more like a compressive structure, and the elastic elements floats around the body. And although it gives support, it does not restrict movement. And what's interesting is that it never falls out of place because it's self-stable. So the tensegrity architecture is very powerful in terms of allowing mobility and stability at the same time. So the next step was to try to test the hypothesis that we could get information out of the global pattern of tension distribution. So could the distribution pattern of tension in the elastic components of the biotensegrity exoskeleton would offer insights into movement and posture. So to test that, what we did was to implement force gauges into the elastic elements. And what you see here are 6 elements. We also had in the front part another one. But basically, we asked the subjects instrumented with the exoskeleton with the force gauge sensors to do 3 different movements. The first one was forward flexion with right rotation, then forward flexion with neutral rotation, and finally forward flexion with left rotation. We also identified continuous lines of force transmission. In this case was elements 1, 3, and 5 that we can see in blue. They are all aligned, so they cooperate, they are synergic in the sense. And also 2, 4, and 6 that we see in red that also make up the same line of force transmission. So we could monitor those lines for each kind of movement performed. Okay. And then we try to see if each pattern could be specific to the movement that the individual performed. So if we could use that to identify the type of motion. So we also computed the tension difference between the lines. So we can see the red, the black, and the blue represent the different movements taking out of the difference between the lines. So we used neural network analysis to do pattern identification and see if we could tell which kind of movement we actually had in each situation based on the tension measured in the gauge sensors, force gauge sensors. So initially, the data from the absolute values of the lines did not classify well the movement. We only had correct classification 68% of the time. But when we did the difference between lines, so we actually analyzed a more global pattern, not the lines, but also the difference between that, the relationship between the lines, we could get a classification that was correct 100% of the time. We also asked about how would look like this global tension pattern. So that's what we see in each situation. So we have here the 8 sensors, different forces measured that you see in the y-axis, and also we have time that was the excursion of the full movement there. So we have this kind of landscape that represented each of the movements that we could see. The lower panel is just the same representation, but forces related to colors. So then we asked, are these global tension patterns actually distinct? Could we use the global pattern to tell the movement apart? Which kind of movement represents to a different pattern? So what we did was to apply a dissimilarity measure called Fretch distance that tests how different each of the curves are, in fact, when we compare each pair. So when we compared left and right, so in a scale that went from 0 to 12, we could see that left and right were totally different. So the global pattern of tension distribution for the left and right rotation was really, really different. And also was different with when we compared left with forward flexion and right with forward flexion. And as we expect, the flexion distance are not so large, but they are more dissimilar than similar. Actually, they are different in each kind of movement. So basically, the idea is that each global pattern of tension distribution in this very simplified model that is just like a minute representation of the global system that we have can generate a tension pattern that is distinct according to the movement. So what's interesting here is that the brain does not need to compute the position or which kind of movement to identify it, because the movement generate a pattern of force distribution that are distinct. So the brain has only to reflect those distinctions. There is no need to computation here, simplifying the process of perception. So patterns of tension distribution may be used to directly inform about postures and movements. So the tensegrity-like structure of bodies may be a major contributor to mechanical sensation, allowing tension distribution and its change. So the idea here is that without having this tensegrity organized body, you would never have this medium, this proper medium that would allow tension distribution changes that would characterize what we call haptic flow. So the haptic flow concept allows the understanding of how mechanical energy is structured to be extracted by mechanical receptors embedded in the body tissues. BiotensegriTea offers a structured medium in which mechanical events are lawfully transformed into information. The association of the concepts of ecological approach with the understanding that the body is a tensegrity structure allows better understanding of the perception of posture and movement. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much. That was lovely. Can you just give us the big picture,
Okay.
where you are, how you got here, you know,
Okay.
just for those of you who don't know you. And I know you're on sabbatical this year.
Yes.
How nice.
Yeah, very good, actually.
And yeah, why don't we just start with you?
Okay. So I'm a full professor of the Department of Physical Therapy at the Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais. That's the Federal University of Minas Gerais. That's the second most important university in Brazil in terms of size and research output. And as a physical therapist, I had a great interest in terms in understanding joint stability. I started this whole thing in terms of investigating joint stability. And what was interesting is that I got my doctorate degree at Boston University in 1997, and then went back to Brazil. And there I worked with dynamic systems approach. So that was the first area. So I was approaching movement in terms of dynamic systems. But also, since my advisor that was Ken Holt, was a very close friend of Michael Turvey, I had the chance to meet Michael Turvey during the time I was there in Boston. And also, we studied the ecological approach and dynamic system approach together because they are very, let's say, complementary. Okay. So with the background in dynamic systems and the ecological approach, I went back to Brazil and started doing my research on joint stability. And there I had the chance to read Stephen's work. Okay, so I had the chance to understand about biotensegrity through him. So the first time that actually I heard about integrity was from his papers. Okay. And then something came up to me, like that I was really affected by this because I had a very influential book in my life that was Kugler and Turvey book. That's the natural law, the information, natural law, no, yeah, something like this, the natural law of rhythm movements. So this paper, in some part,
And this is a paper or a book?
no, a book,
And this is
1987,
by Michael Turvey and
Peter Kugler.
wonderful. Thank you. Okay, we've got it in the chat.
Very influential book.
Yeah.
Very influential book for me. So in this book, Kugler proposed what he called the haptic cube. So in which he was actually trying to make this connection between how kinetic events or mass events or actually real event kinetic could be patterned into what he calls kinematic events that was information. So how it can transform forces into information. And he brought this idea of the haptic cube. But it wasn't well developed because what's in fact is this haptic cube? It was a blob of meat, blob of a piece of the body. There was no actually substance to it. So what I did was, okay, I can see now that I can relate this haptic cube with tensegrity. So tensegrity is the answer for the haptic cube of Peter Kugler. So I did my first sabbatical with Turvey at the CESPA, the Center for the Studies of Perception and Action in Connecticut. And there, in my first week, he asked me to present my work. So I decided to present the idea that the medium for haptic perception would only exist because we have a biotensect organization of our bodies.
Sergio, what year was this approximately?
2005.
Wonderful. Thank you.
So at that moment, when I present the idea, Michael Turv said, okay, you have something here. So let's do it. So we spent 1 year actually working on that. So we had the chance to expand the concepts, bring different areas, and we start actually working on these ideas, putting together the whole area. And 2014, we published the paper. So it was only like 9 years from the beginning to end. It started with a collection of influences, and one really, really large influence was Stefan's work on biotensegrity, so that I could put together the pieces of this, the medium for haptic perception.
Yeah. Which everyone got a link to in the newsletter. So this is great. And now we know how you discovered ecological psychology and how you came to discover biotensegrity and how you came to introduce biotensegrity to the
Michael Turvey.
psychology community. It's a
Yes.
wonderful story.
Yeah.
When we had Julia Blau and Jeffrey Wagman on a few weeks back, Julia remembers, seeing the tensegrity in the classroom and,
Yeah.
all of that. So
She was a student when I was there. She was Claudia
she was there
Carello's
when you were
student.
there.
Yeah. I met her
Uh,
there.
That's great. So what, okay, so we have this field, ecological psychology, and then you're also very active with the community. Um, uh, Duarte Araujo and
Araújo, Duarte Araújo.
yeah,
Yeah.
in Portugal, with that is not ecological psychology, but is ecological perception.
Okay.
Where,
It's not pure ecological psychology.
yeah.
They blend concepts of dynamical systems and with some concepts related to information. Because what happens that in ecological psychology, the concept of information is very different from other areas. So what's ecological information is not any kind of information. So information has a specific meaning, a specific definition. Information is always veridical. Information always relates to properties of the environment. They are lawful. And because of that, we can perceive our words without any kind of mediation by intellectual process.
Mhm.
So that was Gibson's uh, approach. So Gibson is very influential. So he's the father of the ecological psychology approach because he studied how visual perception could be explained without the classical neurophysiological ways that was so important at that time. So
Mhm.
the idea was that visual inputs were too poor, so the brain has to add to it. So kind of, if we try to describe any kind of visual scene, the classical physical approach was describing the inputs as stimulations, and those stimulations would always be in terms of frequency and amplitudes, and because they're not related to the actual event in the world, they could not perceive directly. So that there should be some kind of mediation by the brain that would give meaning to the stimulation. So you have stimulation here that had no meaning, and the brain that gave all the meaning to the stimulation. And Gibson said, no, it's not like that. We can describe this environment in a very different way. And he created a whole field called ecological optics, in which he described the properties of the environment, the visual world, in a totally different way, and create what's called the optical array. And from that, the optical flow. And very studies were done in order to show how people can use this optical flow to regulate their behavior. So instead of having interpretation of the things that happen in the environment, people can actually perceive the environment directly. So that's direct perception. And
Okay. So this field, and I misspoke, called ecological dynamics
mhm,
has become a separate and distinct field, very focused on sports,
yeah.
maybe exclusively focused on sports. I don't know. You know more than I. How did that come to be? How do you see the relationship between ecological psychology, ecological dynamics, biotensegrity? I'm trying to
Okay.
sort of get the understanding of the relationships because I think I told you in the email, I feel like we're long lost cousins
Yeah.
that are meeting after a long time at a family reunion.
Yeah. What happens that, okay, so we in terms of ecological psychology, so information is the key issue. Um, so what happens in sports? In sports, frequently, you have to make decisions about what you're going to do in relation to the opponent, in relation to the situation you are in, right?
Mhm.
So the classical approach is always in terms of using brain powers, computational approach in order to make up and take decisions. So these people start to understand that there is information out there that I can use to regulate my behavior. Okay, so decision make process, they're not so cognitive anymore, they are perceptual.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's the ecological part of the ecological dynamics, because now I'm mixing concepts of dynamic systems, I'm borrowing the concepts of information and creating this new field called ecological dynamics.
Okay.
Okay, so it's neither one nor the other.
Yeah, yeah. It's its own thing.
Its own thing. Okay, so I had the chance to talk to Araújo, uh, Duarte Araújo, and he knew.
I my pronunciation of Portuguese is terrible.
No, yeah. It's a strange name. Actually, his first name is a surname here, so it's even for us it's strange. But so Duarte had a student that wanted to apply um, tensegrity to sports organization. Okay, so he contacted me to do that. So what I told him is that if he wanted to do that, he would have to understand tensegrity as an architecture organization that would allow the flow of information.
Mm-hmm.
So it's something that optimizes the structure, giving stability, but also facilitating the flow of information. So the idea was, how can you have an organization of a collective sport in which the players' distribution would follow some kind of a lawful organization that would take the advantage of the incentive structure in order to keep the stability of the game in terms of protecting its part, and at the same time facilitate the decision-making process by taking out information of the field. So they connected what we did, the linking the integrity to sports was basically that idea. So the architecture that nature selected to be in our bodies, right?
Yes.
Could also give some benefits to players' organization in the field. So that's why tensegrity relates to that, but most of the studies, they don't have anything to do with tensegrity.
Yeah. Okay. I want to get back to sports in a second, and I'll just tell everybody who's here with us in the Zoom room that we'll be going to questions soon. So you can, if you have questions, do the raise hand function if you can, and I'll take everybody in order. And if you can't find that, let us know. Sergio, when you were talking about the speed at which information is communicated within the body, right? So we come in contact with something in our environment. There's a perturbation. It's transmitted through the system. And you said something about the speed of sound.
Mhm.
It came up recently when Daniel Roy was going through the peer review process with his paper. And I'm trying to understand, is that a theory? Is that research based? Because I have a different understanding on that point.
Okay. That was related to the cell. That's the percolation approach done by Forgax that was discussing mechanical sensation. And basically, we have two different views. They don't have to be opposing because they can complement, but it
Yeah.
means that you can have, like, let's say, the classical electrochemical sensation of the cell, but also you have mechanical sensation. And he was advocating that the mechanical sensation would be much faster because within the cell, it would propagate at the speed of sound
Because
and
it
more
would
reliable
propagate as a wave through
as a
the
way
system.
through physical systems, like it's a mechanical wave propagation. And the chemical one would be soluble factors that would be in the cytoplasm of the cell that would have to migrate
Yeah,
very
like
slowly.
electricity would have to pass ion to ion or whatever.
It would be worse than that because it was like a chemical information propagating in a viscous system. That
Okay.
would be much slower than that. And the mechanical one, because the cell has this, everyone knows Ingber's study work. So Ingber described the cell as a tensegrity structure. So that kind of organization, because of this, the elastic filaments and the microtubes, would allow force to propagate the cell very fast and very reliably. And also from cell to cell, allowing coordination in terms of cells, not only because it's crazy. Think about any kind of cell adaptation. It's not about one cell, it's about several cells, right? About the tissue that adapts. So how can I coordinate cells?
Right.
So if you have only soluble factors propagating this viscous system, how would that information be reliably conveyed to our next cell? This problem is solved when we understand that you're talking about a network in the tensegrity system that's all connected, so the cells respond to the same stimuli equally because
Yes.
forces propagate within the system.
Okay.
So that, and he described that as happening at the speed of sound. I don't know if this is in fact because it's not a vacuum, but anyways, né?
So my theory, the theory that we're looking at is that it's even faster than the speed of sound because when you have a tensegrity structure and you make a perturbation, the whole thing responds
Immediately, yeah,
instantly.
yeah,
And so I see it more like if I had a balloon and a string was under tension and I pull the string, the balloon moves because of the tension in the system. The balloon moves instantly,
yeah,
immediately. There's no delay. It's different than if I wiggle the string and I send a signal up to the balloon and then the balloon wiggles.
yeah, yeah. I agree with you
Okay.
because I used what was described for mechanical sensation because it's their field. So
Yeah, no,
I
absolutely.
never use for the body. So, but I totally agree with you because in the tensegrity system, it adapts immediately. So it's an instantaneous response.
Yeah.
I
Okay,
totally,
great. So, I don't know, Steve, did you want to come up before we go to Q&A? I can spotlight you. So I know you haven't been in touch with
Not for years.
Sergio in a while.
it's been a long time. I think it was in Washington, 2015.
Yes.
Yes, I think that's the last we were face to face.
Yeah.
Yes, no, I mean, this is, so exciting stuff to see that biotensegrity is permeating through the sciences, not just one science, just permeates through it. We also have to remember that tensegrities are also oscillators.
Mhm.
So you also get this information through the oscillation through the
Yeah.
system as well as everything else. But I mean, this to me is so we've got it now into the mechanical and the sensory and the haptic. I mean, it's through the whole system and the cell and the organism. I mean, what more do you want out of a theory? So we that's very exciting.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And I have to confess, like the first time I've heard about insectary was through you. So
Well,
uh, nothing would happen if I didn't have the chance to read some of your papers.
well, I'm so glad I got to somebody anyway.
Yeah.
It's slow, it's slowly moving through the world now. So, but it's
Yeah.
people like you who are spreading it through the world. So that's exciting.
I there's a ecological psychology journal. They are preparing this special issue on Turvey's work. So it's going to be a tribute to Turvey. And I wrote a paper on the tensegrity hypothesis, and there, this whole story is going to be
Oh, wonderful.
told in detail. So I hope that that would be something that can describe better than 2014 paper what is this tensegrity haptic hypothesis.
Well, that's just beautiful. I really, really so thankful that we've gotten this out to the world now.
It's very good, yeah.
So,
And there are a lot of people that want to know more about this. It became like a very big hit. It's growing, I have to say.
wonderful. So there's a lot of excitement. Steve, I'm gonna take you off the spotlight as we go to questions. I'm looking in the chat, and there's Joe Pristila's talking about Joe, and I'm wondering if you could come on, because Sergio is an expert in sports injury as well. And Sergio, we spoke a few tea parties back with some people in the baseball community, and Joe, I'm going to spotlight you, and they're trying to solve the problem of, for example, with pitchers, the Tommy John surgeries that have become ubiquitous. And so Joe is also asking about your suit. So go ahead, Joe.
Okay. Hi,
Yeah,
Joseph.
first of all, an outstanding presentation. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Yeah, a couple of months ago, we had on Paul Davis, who's the director of pitching development for the Atlanta Braves. And of course, the baseball. I mean, there's so much data, with this, and they have the suits that matter, that measure kinetics and kinematics, going through the elbow and everything. But it doesn't seem to be helping. It seems to really, if anything, making things worse. So, when I saw this suit, I said, wow. It's because one of the things that Paul was talking about, and the reason he came on was because he was talking about somewhere in the chain, the loss of tension somehow going through the body, or maybe tension, what you have too much happening at the wrong time. And I saw that biotensegrity suit. I thought that was really neat. And but I saw that it only goes into right now anyway, only goes into the upper arm, goes through the
We
legs.
have a full. It's full. It goes to the hand, but that version,
Oh, okay, cool.
yeah, it goes to the hand.
So is it accessible?
It is, yeah. We can think about it, yeah, because it's still a prototype, and actually we working. Uh, it's going to come out in a few months as a product, because it was in research most of the time. And it's quite interesting because what we talked about is quite important, because when you talk about a chain, the weakest point is always related to a difference in stiffness, right? So the motion follows the least resistance. So if you have in a link a region that offers less resistance, that area is going to be stressed, right? So the suit can provide you with this external framework that can be manipulated in a way to adjust the pre-stress that will provide a very, let's say, well-distributed tension pattern that will help to protect tissues. So the beauty is that you can adjust pre-stress. That's what we wanted. So for each individual, you can change the pre-stress, and the change in pre-stress will change posture. And the beauty is that, let's say, if I change the posture of something, let's say, for example, if I rotate here, I'm going to increase the tension here, but these elements are going to be stretched, right? So I'm going to move. I'm not going to force you out of posture. I'm going to create a new resting position. Okay. It's a new resting position. Now I have the tension in the two sides equal in the new position. It means that I'm going to be as movable as I was in the natural position. So I can provide support without disturbing movement. So that's why it's stable and flexible. It's kind of beautiful what tensegrity can allow us. So in this case, for a picture, if you identify in evaluation there are weak links, you can adjust pre-stress in order to make it more, let's say, homogeneous, more stable in this sense, and protect tissue. So it's a possibility. We never did anything related to that. We did with soccer kicks in terms of improving the efficiency of kicks. We did with children with cerebral palsy. We did with Down syndrome. That is the most exceptional results we ever had. Children with Down syndrome, it's crazy. It's unbelievable because they have low pre-stress. And by wearing the suit, they not only have the benefits of a more stable body, but also they have heightened perceptual capabilities. And they can explore themselves, their bodies, and they start to do things that they were never thought before, like in a few minutes. It's almost crazy.
Wow, where is that research? That's amazing.
That's coming out, yeah.
Oh, that's exciting. So these suits are not just for getting measurements or of certain movements. They're actually remedial and can be supportive for and therapeutic.
Yeah, we did the sensor part in order to test the hypothesis, but we start to realize that, okay, we have a new body here that we can provide people. So that's why we start to use it with sports and also with children with cerebral palsy first, and then children with Down syndrome. But this one's being used as a therapeutic tool.
Can I just ask Sergio, if you probably haven't done this yet, but if they're wearing, I'm thinking of these children with Down syndrome, but any of these athletes wearing the suit that has been adjusted to give them more easeful freedom of movement, you probably haven't. I would be so curious if they wore it long enough, how does the body self-adapt to then incorporate and be happy at this new state?
Very good. Yeah,
That
beautiful
would be
question.
amazing.
A beautiful question, because, okay, as a physical therapist, I thought that the suit would be a tool that would help me to change the pattern of use of individuals in a long process. I would change the properties, the tissue properties. So the benefits would come up like way down the road. That's my initial thought. But it was surprising that the effects, they lasted longer than we expected after using the suit. So there was improvement that
So
remained. For example, in those studies that I showed, for example, back then, we had one individual that had low back pain, and he spent the whole day like adjusting the sensors and putting the thing and doing the test. And so it took a little long in order to do that. So he wore the suit for a long time. And then he came up the next day, said that he had a wonderful night and he was pain-free at that day. And the only thing that he did was to wear the fact that he wore the suit. So it was a surprise for me.
So he probably wanted to have the suit of his own so he could wear it more often. But I am now wondering, he wore the suit for a day. His body is getting used to this new, happier, more pleasant feeling state, more efficient. Takes the suit off, but the body's learned something new that lasts for a period of time.
That seems, yeah, it seems.
And
yeah.
that seems to me to tie into everything you were discussing before about the ecological perspective. Excuse the language if I'm making mistakes here. So it's, I mean,
You're right. Like there is a perceptual benefit, not only mechanical, but also a perceptual one. It seems.
So it's as though we feel something new. The body somehow does something with the nerve, well, everything, the whole system to help us stay in that new state,
Yeah.
which is very exciting because people with pain, people with injury, we want an instant response, like a quick response, not the months. And I also imagine that then moving around, just living in this more efficient state, then the body over time, the tissues will self-adapt. So that's the new normal.
Yeah, that's my initial approach was to change the resting position, and working the new resting position, I would give the stimulus to change the tissue. So tissue adaptation would happen in a long term. But we start seeing effects that was much faster with them. So that was, for me, an indication that there was more than just mechanical effects.
Yeah, that's very exciting. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. We've got a question about the visual perception book. That was James Gibson.
James Gibson, yeah. He
Yeah.
has two, and the 1950 was the first one, and 79 the second one. You can find everywhere. The second one is the best one because it has a more modern language. So the 1979.
Yeah. Okay, great. I'm going to bring Jim. Do you want to come up? I'm going to
Thank you. Oh, I'm so excited to ask a question. It's so exciting, Dr. Fonseca, and just being here with, I'm so excited by Graham's work and Dr. Levin's work, but this is a simple question I want to ask relative to motor control theory and the tendency in motor control theory to focus on the upper extremity, which makes sense. But I wonder if in your modeling of the suit and your own consideration of the kinematics of the upper extremity, if you're familiar with Kibler's work on the kinetic chain and its role to the scapula, is a good simple question. I wonder what you think about that, or if you've read Kibler.
Now, the body is a kinematic chain. There is no way to consider that this would apply only to the lower limbs. And the scapula is the basis for any kind of motion that we do with our arms. And actually, the scapula, it changes the configuration of the arm itself. So I don't know if that's the question that you're asking for, but scapula is the key.
Yes, of course. Yes. I guess my question is in that suit, which is such an amazing thing. I would love to try that. You would never have my size, but
no, I have any size, because what we're doing now is just to have the nodes and the cables, and you put yourself the way you want.
Oh, I see. Oh, how exciting. You just need a body tight suit. I wonder though,
you don't need a suit. If you put it properly, it stays over you without any fixation. If you follow the integrity principles, it is going to be self-stable.
That's interesting.
How does it stick?
It's just a node. Yeah, a plastic node, flexible.
Oh,
but it floats. It's not stick to anything. Sorry, Tim.
So I wonder how well the suit actually senses the scapular foundation for arm movements, which is very important, and it is the postural basis for the coordination of the glenohumeral joint. And we tend to focus on the glenohumeral joint rather than the very important, more difficult to perceive and measure movements of the scapula. And I just wanted to see what you thought about that.
We can't monitor the scapula with the suit because the scapula, I can't get the position of the scapula. Okay, so I don't know about the scapula. But what's interesting is that the position of the scapula is dependent on the position of the pelvis and the thoracic spine. So what we did was to change the pelvis position,
Mhm.
and we changed the position of the scapula just by manipulating the pelvis.
Nice. There you go.
And by doing that, we modified the motion of the arms. So the pelvis was a key issue for the motion of the shoulder based on the changes that
The pelvis.
happened on the scapula.
And if I can ask one more question, and I put a whole long text in, but I'd really love to get your response because the primary perceptual systems of the body, the two primary perceptual systems are proprioception and exteroception, and you define proprioception as awareness of the parts, which is quite. I've never seen that, and it is from my reading of Sherrington, and I've done a very careful, close reading of Sherrington. I would characterize proprioception quite differently and compare it very much to the nucleoskeleton and its role within the cell, rather than characterizing it as perception of the parts, which I understand that's the positional awareness is always studied in the extremities, but I think that's a very important distinction to make.
But the position of the parts and the relation among parts. So the whole is part of the parts. So, but I have to have a perception of the parts, the perception of the relationship among the parts, and the perception of the whole, all by the body itself. And that's the crucial thing, is the perception of the parts together or separate, using only the parts. And that's what's perception. In terms
You don't
of,
think that the axial line, the spine plays an important role in that?
pardon me?
You don't think the spine plays an important role in that as a mechanical system, as a muscular mechanical system?
A spine?
Yeah, the axis.
Actually, depends on what you're talking about. The spine as a structure, or not the medulla you're talking about, the spine.
No, the biomechanical either. But I think perhaps if I'm taking you off topic, I don't need to pursue that. That's
No.
a more complex subject.
No, for me, I see the way I see pelvis and trunk are crucial for any kind of motion. So even for perception or anything, they must be included in any kind of analysis. But you can create situations in which perception is done without them, right?
Mhm.
I can perceive my foot, I can perceive my hand without invoking the spine on this. But when you go to a functional situation, that's probably where you're coming from. Functionally, the spine is involved in everything because that's
Yes, of course.
Largest mass. So biomechanically, it's fundamental to understand what the spine does.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. It's a tremendous progress and excitement. Reading your stuff makes me really excited. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Steve, Graham, did either one of you want to come up? Steve, you had a few things.
Well, I just want to say I wrote an article on that in God knows when, 2005. The scapula is a sesamoid bone.
Yep.
That handles some of those issues. Of course, I would expand on it now, but at that time I was talking about the scapula as a stabilizing point that floats on the thoracic wall. It doesn't compress on anything.
Yeah. And all bones are sesamoid bones, would you say?
My theory is a sesamoid bone.
To expand the concept, that's right. Yeah.
Right.
Exactly right. All right. Well, last chance for questions, my friends. I don't see any hands up. Oh, okay. Alex, sorry.
No worries, either
hold on.
or.
Yeah. Come on up.
Hi, Dr. Fonseca. Thanks for the presentation. So a little background about me: massage therapist with a BA in philosophy and psychology, really focusing on philosophy of perception. And I still feel like perception is a tricky term. And it was actually felt like it was being touched upon in Jim's last question with regards to proprioception. And so I think prior conception of proprioception would be like sensory information through the mechanical receptors and is being processed through like a central organizing like function of mind, right? The ecological approach kind of puts perception in the action itself. So it's not necessarily being organized by a mind. Is that kind of online?
Yep. Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
no central executive.
Yep.
Right. So I was hoping you can clarify this whole idea of the haptic cube, because it seems like that was a real big pivotal moment with regards to the ecological theory. So can you explain a little bit more the limitations of the haptic cube before tensegrity came in?
Because it was just a theoretical proposition of Kugler
I
of
see.
how forces that he called kinetic stimulation, so forces, would be transformed into information. Because the key issue, first of all, like what's the problem with ecological psychology? Because it uses two words that have different meanings for different people. One is information. The other one is perception. Okay. So for him, like asking how forces are patterned into information was a key issue. Okay. Because in the classical view, information resides on the perceiver. So it's an interpretation. So there's no information. There are just stimulation. You have stimulation, and that stimulation goes to the brain or to any kind of area that you believe, and that area will do the perceiving. Okay? So perceiving is not direct. Perceiving is mediated by something that is an epistemic mediator of reality. You don't have contact with reality. So if you work in this philosophy of perception, that's the big issue for a long time. Can we perceive reality? Right? And basically, the winning idea is that we can't, because our senses are poor, so something has to mediate this. So perception is always indirect. Gibson's work was to show that our interpretation of reality is actually what was poor there, not our senses, because the existing information out there is much greater than imagined. Okay, so he did that in terms of optical information. Okay, so he created this whole theory, and it's a must-read situation. Like you have to get in contact with Gibson itself. There's no way to understand ecological psychology without Gibson, because he does a very nice description of the kind of information that you get in touch every day. And the word's rich in information. So, and for him, what's information? Information is specific to its source. Okay. So, for example, I'll try to do a better job now, just to explain a little bit in terms of visual perception, because it's much easier than haptic perception. Okay. So, for example, when you walking through a corridor, okay, and you want to keep in the middle of the corridor, so you don't want to hit the walls, which kind of information do you use? Normally, you'd say that you look at something and you process that information in order to keep you in the proper position. So it's an active behavior that it's driven by a cognitive process that wants to keep you in the middle. But in fact, when you walk through a corridor, you have an optical pattern that is related to your direction of motion. So it's kind of the texture of the environment deforms according to your direction and to your speed. So you have information about that pattern directly. You don't need to compute because it's related to reality. So if you approach, for example, one side of the corridor, the optical pattern of that side that you approach becomes faster than the other one that's farther. So that's difference between the two sides specifies that you moving towards one side instead of keeping the middle. So you adjust your behavior in order to equalize the optical flow. So using information to adjust your behavior, even though you're not aware that you're using that information. So for Gibson, it's perception, but classical way of understand perception is awareness. So it's crazy because you use information before you're sensitive to it. So for Gibson, it's perception. For most people, it's not perception because you're not aware. Right? But you're not aware, but you're acting accordingly. It's crazy because I can simulate a situation in a virtual corridor in which we can speed up one side of the pattern, and you're going to move accordingly. And if I ask you if you perceive that, you say no, but you did exactly what the pattern told you to do. So you're sensitive to it, and you act on it, but you doesn't know about it. That's perception, direct perception that I use to guide my movement. So haptic perception has to be equally. But what's the source of haptic perception? What's the kind of information in our body that I can use to regulate the speed of my motion, the force that I produce, if I'm moving towards one side or another? It cannot be computed all the time on the basis of mechanoreceptors that are located in different parts of my body. I must have a global variable, a global pattern of stimulation that's specific to the thing that I'm doing. So anything that's specific to reality is information. Because
that coordinates it all. Yeah.
we allow coordination is the result of this flow. So reading Gibson will give you a better sense of what I'm saying, but it's interesting to see that the word perception in ecological approach is different from the classical approach. The word of information in ecological approach is different from the classical approach. So it's very important to frame those words into the theory to understand what the other one's saying. And that's a big problem. That's something that is, I think it's a weakness, because I'm using the same word to mean different things. And I won't be understood properly. So that's a big problem.
Unfortunately, that fractaled offered various different questions I want to ask, but I don't want to go too far off. I was just wondering if you can explain a bit more, because my understanding was that Gibson kind of critiqued the Gestalt psychologists, because I feel like their project was kind of doing the same thing back in the beginning of the 20th century. Are you aware of his critique of the Gestalt psychologists?
Yep. There are some similarities, but also differences. Okay, the similarity is that the whole is more than parts. So for the Gestalt, the whole actually is the pattern of stimulation, but the difference is that stimulation was still present. So instead of a local stimulation, it was a global stimulation, but it still was stimulation. And for Gibson was actually information. So it's kind of a minute difference, but important for Gibson. And that's why the criticism arose. But it was better than the classical view that was existing at the time. So at least the Gestalt approach is more in line with a global variable instead of these parts that must be put together, because it creates what we call the degrees of freedom problem. If you separate things into parts, you have to devise something that is able to put everything together. So you're increasing the computational problem of anything. So we decided one day that we need to understand the small part in order to understand phenomena. But when we did that, we eliminated phenomena, because so many small parts, we lost the interaction, and the interaction was actually what was important. So it's impossible to understand a system like this. And Gestalt was at least right in terms of understanding the interaction, not only the parts. But for Gibson, it's not stimulation, but information.
Understood. Thank you so much. I'll yield the floor to anybody else. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Alex. Here's what I want to know, Sergio. My question. So a lot of us studying biotensegrity, like me, we are maybe what you would call an outsider scientist. We are studying this because we are passionate about it. We love it, but we are outside the walls of academia. You are inside those walls, and what we get a lot of in the community, depending on who is doing what, is we get pushback. This is not a scientific approach. This is not an accepted approach. The physiotherapists, and I don't know if anyone from the physiotherapy community is here that wants to come up, but we've had situations where they're changing their protocols because they've become informed by what's going on with biotensegrity. And then they get told, no, you cannot do that. You have to follow this, even if their results are better, faster, more effective, whatever. And so a lot of people in official positions or whatever are getting pushback. So what I would like from you is, you've been in this for a long time. Your advice to people in the community who are getting this kind of pushback.
Okay. What I see as a physical therapist, maybe I'm in a good position to talk about what the clinician thinks and what the science says. In the beginning, in order to start actually promoting tensegrity and introducing, remember, like I was there in 2005 and I left 2006. I published that paper in 2014.
Yeah.
Okay. So what was in between? Was not the idea, because the idea was totally ready there. So was the need to come up with more scientific
Support
results
with the rationale.
Yes.
Yes.
That would talk the scientific language to give support to what we said. For example, we did studies to show pre-stress. So, okay, we have a pre-stressed system. So the musculoskeletal system is pre-stressed. So it's kind of, I tried to do a little bit what Ingber did with the cell.
But you also, in that 2014 paper, did a really good job, I thought, of saying, this is why what's currently being thought of is not working. You need something that can account for all environmental perturbations for all organisms through all time. Now, what can do that?
But that's what I'm saying. Like, for the scientific community, I have to provide data, I have to provide support. So I would be respected. I can be convincing. My idea could be appealing. I can show results, but without data, it's difficult, because the scientist is data driven.
Yeah.
Right. So that's what we had to do to at least to put a very comprehensive, let's say,
framework.
Yes, that would make the idea that we're trying to convey more scientific appealing. So we brought things from all areas. That was the enterprise.
Yeah.
To make it strong enough to be more resistance to criticism that we kind of doing hocus pocus. Because what I see, the problem of tensegrity is that sometimes the language is poor. Okay, there are some people use tensegrity as something that I even don't know what they're saying when they say tensegrity. So
Agreed. Agreed.
there's like from Castaneda's religion kind of thing to some people that talk about energies, talk about synergies, holiness,
Yeah,
because
yeah. Sacred geometry. I know. Yeah.
so and this is a problem because it takes credit out of something that is scientific.
Yeah.
Tensegrity is scientific because tensegrity is nature's way of creating structures, viable structures, right?
Yes. Viable, sustainable. Exactly. Agreed. Agreed. Wonderful.
So the problem is that, like, sometimes you talk to someone and you hear things that, okay, my God, I came out of talks that people would come to me and said, "Oh, thank you very much because now I understand this." And he or she says something from, "Oh my God, I never said anything like that. It's not what I said." I'm reinforcing those non-scientific type of beliefs. So we have a non-homogeneous community
Yeah.
and very nice work, very nice therapeutic approaches in between something that is not, but they all call it the same.
Yeah.
They all call it the same.
Yeah.
So
This is
that's the problem.
that's a very good point. Very good point. Bob, did you have anything you wanted to say? I
Oh, yes, thank you. I came into the meeting late, but I want to thank Sergio for having the research because I had that exact experience Susan said. I finished a 2-hour talk at a Physical Therapy Association meeting, and one of my first questions was, well, everything you said for the past 2 hours is nonsense and not supported by research. And so, I said, well, I've had success treating patients for 30 years, so I think that's something for that. But I wish a year or so ago I had, was aware of your research, but now I'll have better comebacks with everything. But it is valuable, and your research and a lot of the others that are coming out recently just give us support for for those in the clinic because I said we all face those questions. So I just wanted you asked if anybody wanted to come up, Susan. So I
thank you for representing.
Yeah.
All right. Steve, did you have any last words?
Well, I just want to point out that the same thing happened with Skelton, who picked up on tensegrity and moved it out of what the original concept of tensegrity was with Fuller and Snelson. So he distorted that concept, which sort of loused it up for a lot of us in that field. That got very confusing. I think
Yes.
it's coming right back now to those of us who understand it as a very specific concept, so that the biotensegrity is rooted in the original concept of Fuller and Snelson.
Mhm.
And once you stray past that, it gets very sloppy.
Well, Skelton, of course, is an engineer and he's looking for the engineering benefits. So he had a very different framework and motivation.
Right, but again, but you should call it something else. You shouldn't call it tensegrity because it's not, by Snelson's definition and Fuller's definition, it's not tensegrity.
Right, right, right. That would be Skelton's class 1 tensegrity.
Right.
Yeah. Whereas Skelton also had the other classes. Yeah, exactly.
And Fuller also took to synergy, like his book, like synergy, and
Right.
then you link tensegrity to all kinds of synergy,
Right.
and even spiritual synergies
Yes.
or
Well, that's
spiritual.
yeah.
So you lost control.
Yeah. Steve, did you want to give us a closing toast, maybe?
I would be glad to. I think that Sergio has put it all together for us in a way that we haven't been able to do before because we now see that biotensegrity expands through the whole system rather than
Hold
just
on a sec. Yeah, please, if you want to turn on your cameras for the toast, and I'll take the spotlight off so that we can see everybody. Sorry to interrupt you,
no problem.
Steve. I'm just going to make it so everybody can kind of see everybody. And go ahead.
Well, Sergio has done for us what has been very difficult for those who are uh, mechanical oriented, like the orthopedic surgeons in us, that uh, and that we've focused on just the physical aspects of this, and it really is a much wider concept, and it has been from the beginning. It's just I've had difficulty expressing it, and certainly now that it's in the other fields, we really can appreciate the depth of the concept. And it was a lucky guess on my part, I must tell you, that it's worked out this way. I am not a genius by any means. It was just pure luck. I was in the right place at the right time.
Very
So,
good.
yeah, I think that I'm very proud of what has been accomplished and very thankful to Sergio and others who are doing this kind of work. Thank you all, and toast to it.
All right, Jean.
Thank you. Cheers, Jean.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank
very
you
much.
again, Sergio. That was just really so delightful and wonderful and sort of nutritive.
Thank you very much.
I'm going to take us off of YouTube if I can figure out how to do that.